What is up, guys? This is Jose Youngs with MMAfighting.com with my partner in crime, Petesy Carroll. Per usual, this is, of course, not the A side. This is something we're going to try a little differently going forward. This is going to be a solely social media experience where we're going to answer some of your video questions that you're going to send in. We don't really have a name for it yet. Someone suggested A+ side. That might be a mouthful, but so maybe you guys tell us what we should call this. But of course, this is only going to be on social media, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and stuff like that. So not YouTube and not the podcast. This is solely for our viewers that are tuning in on social media. You can send us your video questions, tell us your name and where you're from, and we can answer them. So without further ado, Casey, cue up the first question.
Hi guys and girls, this is Jason from the UK. Just wondering with social media and how it influences society in general, whether online polls and things like that are soon going to be the way that contenders are chosen for fights, because it seems as though a lot of fighters use social media, i.e. John Jones doing polls, etc. Do you think that eventually the rankings will be no more and we will maybe use things like online and social media platforms to choose number one contenders and or fights? Keep up the great work. As I say, love from the UK.
Well, thank you so much, Jason, for the question. Lots of love from the UK. I imagine a lot of these questions will be from the UK, Petesy's neck of the woods. But interesting question nonetheless about fighters using social media to create polls and maybe drum up interest in fights. I'm going to go off of the polls thing for a second because, yes, we see a lot of fighters try to pick fights on social media. We saw a lot with Aljamain Sterling and Henry Cejudo over the weekend. That kind of got kind of ugly real quick. But for the rankings part, I wouldn't mind maybe a fan rankings, maybe outside of the panel rankings. I know as our resident college football expert here, Petesy Carroll, I don't have to remind you that there are multiple rankings in college football. They have the college football playoff rankings, they have the AP rankings, they have the coaches poll, and they really, when they show them, when they're talking about these things on ESPN or CBS or wherever, they show like, oh, Georgia might be ranked number 2 in the coaches poll, but they're ranked number 4 on the AP poll and this and that. So I wouldn't hate seeing a fan poll. It might get a little muddled, considering some people might vote for fighters that they prefer or their countrymen or whatever. But I think it would be interesting to see someone like a Paul Felder who's fighting this weekend against Dan Hooker. Like, oh, he's number X. Like he could be like number 3 in the official poll, but then he's number 18 on the fan poll. That could just kind of show you something. It would be a little bit of a differentiation between them, and I wouldn't hate seeing it, especially it could show exactly who the fans are interested in. But I'd like to hear your perspective on how social media could play a factor moving forward, making these fights.
I actually think it's already playing a huge factor in making fights, and people's social media imprint, their following is dictating where they're being put on cards already. And so I think it's a very relevant question from Jason. Even in Ireland and the UK, in terms of the Bellator European series, like people feel as though the placement on the card is completely decided on, and social media following. That is one of the conspiracy theories out there. So maybe we're not so far removed from what Jason's saying here. Is it going to get to a stage where a number one contender is picked off social media? Should that be the way it is? It feels like we're going further and further away from meritocracy constantly in this sport. So, I feel like it's a very pertinent question, and I wouldn't at all be surprised if it actually did start being decided like that. Look at the UFC these days. Look at Bellator. Look at all these things. Social media and social media followings are definitely having a bigger impact than ever. So I don't think it feels like it's nearly like a Black Mirror theory for MMA, but I think it absolutely could happen.
I think you definitely say play a big factor in maybe fighters turning down fights. Maybe they don't have a big following, or like Paige VanZant herself said, she makes more money posting on Instagram, like those sponsored posts, than she does fighting in the UFC. And Dana White was like, cool, like congrats, like good, go do that. Like don't take brain damage and make more money. There was that big narrative when Amanda Nunes knocked off Ronda Rousey and Chris Cyborg, like, oh, this is terrible. Amanda Nunes has knocked off the two most marketable stars on social media that the UFC has in those two divisions. So it's a double-edged sword. I think it could clearly benefit some fighters that to make some extra bread. Or what if you're champion and you don't really use social media much? Maybe people won't be interested in you fighting. But then social media could also, like, does Twitch count as social media? Because Demetrius Johnson and Stipe Miocic are huge on Twitch. Sugar Sean O'Malley is big on Twitch. So if we're counting that too, it's a no-brainer that social media will eventually play a massive factor, if it doesn't already play a factor, in how they book these fights. Well, again, thank you so much, Jason, for the question. Of course, you are the first ever video question submitted that we answered, so you always have that honor. But for now, Casey, roll the next question.
Hello, I am Eduardo Ariño de la Rubia, and I'm currently in Zurich, Switzerland. Elias Theodore is the first MMA fighter to receive a therapeutic use exemption for medical cannabis. I'm quite happy for him and look forward to his continued success in PFC. My two questions are: 1. What MMA fighters and personalities do you think would benefit from smoking more weed? 2. This year is the 5th anniversary of USADA. I'd love to know where you think the sport would be today if USADA had never, ever happened. Thank you.
My God, he's handsome. That man is beautiful. His beard, his complexion, the glasses. I mean, wow. I'm a bit hot under the collar after reading that. You're going to have to tell me what the questions were again. I got lost in his eyes.
So I wasn't going to say anything, but Eduardo from Zurich, 11 out of 10 beard, I must say. And if I'm going to give you any sort of career advice, you would make a great voice actor, I will say. So definitely look into that. But in terms of the questions, Petesy, of course, Elias Theodore becomes one of the first fighters to get TUE from the British Columbia Athletic Commission for marijuana. He's fighting in PFC. So I don't know if you remember, he has been a massive advocate for this movement, even when he was in the UFC before he was released. So no surprise that he continued the fight even after he was released from the UFC, but he does make history as becoming the first MMA fighter to receive a TUE exemption for medical marijuana. But in terms of his questions, which fighters or personalities do you think would benefit most from smoking a little bit of weed? I know my answer, and is none other than your crush, Sage Northcutt, because I want to see it happen.
I think all of them could benefit from it. Why not? Like, maybe all of you should smoke a bit of grass, you know what I mean? Just to see what happens. I know you all have never tried it, so give it a go, maybe, you know?
We're not all from the rough and tumble fist fighting culture of Ireland, Pete. You are walking down the street, all of a sudden you tie your shoes and you're fighting 40 men at once. So no, but I think I would like to watch Sage Northcutt smoke weed with the Diaz brothers. I think that would be a lot of fun because I bet the Diaz brothers have no idea people like Sage Northcutt exist, and I bet Sage Northcutt has no idea people like the Diaz brothers exist, and I would love to see that clash of personalities.
I'd love to see the Diaz brothers smoking weed. Imagine that. That would be crazy.
I think we've seen it once or twice.
What? No.
Yeah. And then, of course, the second part of the second question, Eduardo from Zurich dropped in, is it's the 5-year anniversary of USADA. What have you made of the last 5 years, and where do you think the sport would be if this never happened?
I have very mixed views on USADA, to be honest with you. I feel like they've got it wrong a lot. And I feel like with a situation like this, you got to get it right all the time. And obviously that was never going to happen. But I feel like the amount of times they've got it wrong has really it stopped me from being a big kind of, getting behind it and celebrating it there. I think we all want clean sport. We obviously don't want to see people coming in here and damaging each other with illegal substances, performance-enhancing substance in their bodies. But they've got it wrong an awful lot, and I think that's a huge black mark against them, unfortunately.
Yeah, it feels like they were figuring things out as they went, and I feel like they jumped into this. Like, you see a lot of the stuff with like the Josh Barnett's and the Tom Lawlers, where they lose out on massive parts of their career and then they get released or whatever, and like that really screws them. But then you see fighters like John Jones, who the UFC moves a entire card for, like the week of the fight, from Las Vegas to California, and then you see like fighters like Jessica Penne having to work other jobs because she's so tied up and USADA drama. But then on the flip side, Nate Diaz gets popped for something, says, nah, I didn't take anything. And all of a sudden USADA's like, yeah, you're probably right. You can keep fighting again. So I wish they were, as in life, I wish everything was a little more fair. Like they treated every fighter the same. But in terms of where the sport would be, it's hard to say. I mean,
the value of the UFC wouldn't be what it was if it wasn't there. That's really what it felt like it was there for in hindsight, right?
Yeah, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I think the UFC saying that they have some sort of anti-doping, USADA, the U.S. anti-doping agency, is the ones running everything. I think gives them a lot of credibility in the eyes of fans that don't really know a lot of the information. They don't see like we cover the sport. We see all this stuff. We know what's happened to Josh Barnett and the Tom Lawlers and the Jessica Pennes and all that. Casual fans might not know those names, but they know John Jones and they know Nate Diaz and this and that. So they see what USADA, they see the name USADA, they see it's tied to the UFC. It's on now, UFC's on ESPN. I think in the eyes of casual fans or maybe people that only kind of watch at a distance, it definitely adds some credibility to the brand of the UFC.
Well, when you're inside the sport and the likes of the Brock Lesnar situation happened before Mark Hunt fight, it's like, this isn't even a thing. Why are we pretending this is a thing? You've just given a guy an exemption. One of the guys that most people would point to in a line if you asked them, like, which one of these is on PEDs? And you let him just basically go in and fight Mark Hunt like that. And, you know, you want us to look at Mark Hunt like he's the bad guy after that. Like, I mean, it's crazy. And there's obviously the huge double standard, as you mentioned, for John Jones. It needs to be a uniform situation for every single one of them. And that's what really that's the bee in my bonnet about this one, Jose.
It's similar to, I'd like to see maybe it's like the WWE has like strikes, or like the Major League Baseball has strikes. Like first time you pop for something, this happens. Second time, this. And it's like the same thing every time. Like your second pop in baseball is like 50 games. Third one, I think, I can't remember the exact one.
You're in the World Series.
Exactly. And the third one, you're like, and then eventually you're just banned from baseball altogether. Like you can never play in professional, like Major League Baseball ever again. I don't know how the UFC would do that, or USADA, because they do have to do all the testing for the tainted supplements and everything. I really wish they had started it from the beginning, where even if you do get popped, they run the testing first before announcing it was for a tainted supplement, because like Yoel Romero fails his drug test. It turns out it's tainted supplements, but now his name is tied to a failed drug, an anti-doping violation for the rest of his career, even though he might not have done anything wrong. I really wish they had figured that situation out first, rather than just announcing, potential anti-doping violation. We're going to test first. And then it turns out he didn't do anything wrong. It was just unmarked. It was just incorrectly marked substance or vitamin he was taking or protein shake he was taking, and then but he's tied to it forever. I wish they had figured that situation out right out of the gate.
They need to just stop testing people and popping people for weed at this stage as well. Like, I mean, it's ridiculous. It's in such widespread use, like everywhere. So you're telling me if John Jones or whoever, you know, think of any fighter goes into a room and someone's smoking a joint there, they're going to lose out on all this money. They're going to lose out on all this money they spent on their camp. You know what I mean? Like, I don't know, you know, how much you need in your system to piss hot or whatever, but I just feel at this stage, you know, it's as common as alcohol. Like, I mean, it just shouldn't be tested.
I do think it should be allowed. I've had people argue with me that, like, yeah, it should be allowed, but if your contract says you can't smoke weed, just don't smoke weed. Like, I don't know if it's that clear cut and dry because I've never signed a fight contract, but like, someone once presented to me, like, if your contract says you can't smoke, you can't eat Jell-O for 3 months or you don't get paid, just don't eat Jell-O. I'm like, a little different because you're getting punched in the face a lot, and medical marijuana actually has like benefits.
All right, but like, it's also the thing where they revise the situation and then they're like, oh well, if you stop 2 weeks out, you should be fine. Like that's crazy. Like that's not how this works.
I know.
Oh, give it 10 days to 14, you should be fine. Like, come on, it's ridiculous. Get rid of it.
Even they were saying like after TJ Dillashaw and the EPO situation, like they weren't even testing for EPO half the time.
Come on,
even Dana White was like, "What are you talking about?" Like,
come on,
if
guys.
anything, like EPO would have one of the most benefits because like all of a sudden your cardio is through the roof and you're in there. So,
and it's the same punishment is going for people who are pissing hot for weed as it is EPO. Come on, taking the piss out of me.
It's a little not. I wish they had fine-tuned this whole thing out before they dove into it head first, because
it really almost seems like they were trying to sell the company for a lot of money or something, doesn't it?
Right. It seems like it not even seems like it's ruined a lot of careers, and a lot of fighters seem to be suspicious of it now, moving forward. But nonetheless, it is here to stay. Maybe it changes in the future, but I think you hit it right on the head. It sure seems like they were trying to sell it for $4.6 billion when they announced this, right?
So it's been great for the UFC. In short, really good for the UFC.
Well, again, thank you so much, Eduardo, from Zurich. I know Petesy was struggling to find words. I don't know if you could see him half the time, but your beard has really captivated him. It's really influenced his life, similar to how I influenced Niall in his life. But Eduardo, I think you have a fantastic future in.
I love you, Eduardo.
What I hope is voice acting, because man, oh man. But again, people want to see that beard. But without further ado, Casey, let's roll the next question.
Yo, A-Side live chat, homies. I'm just wondering, big fan of the show, by the way, since the early Luke Thomas days, through the dark Sean Al-Shatti, Mark Ramundi days, I'm just kidding, and up until the golden era now, lots of Petesy, Carroll, the more the merrier. Love that. I'm just wondering, as someone who enjoys a lot of stuff around and outside the sport, what your favorite ways to enjoy and delve into the sport outside of the actual fights is. So for me, it's stuff like your podcast, documentaries, and lots of podcasts and interviews and stuff. Would you say there is that rarity out there, a good book about MMA to get into, a good writer to recommend? I'd recommend Kareem Zidane. Do you know what I mean? Just stuff outside the fights that you'd recommend to enhance and develop your MMA fandom. Cheers from London, Jeff.
So, Jeff B., first of all, I got to give you a shout out for the water stunts little thing you want to throw into that video. As someone who is a avid collector of books and one who has wears his Reading a Sexy pin everywhere, I much appreciated that. Second of all, for any future questions submitted, you don't have to shove the mic into your mouth when you're asking. We'll let this one slide because Jeff asked such an interesting question. But yes, we could hear you loud and clear.
Thank you, Jeffrey.
The very
lovely compliments.
I'm really glad you also pointed out the dark era of the Sean and Mark time. Like, it's like the dark ages of the UFC, the dark ages of the live chat. But nonetheless, Petesy, very interesting question. How we kind of absorb the sport outside of actually covering the fight. He mentioned Kareem Zidane, a fellow SB Nation Vox employee over at Bloody Elbow. He does phenomenal work. I think he's one of the best journalists in all of sports, let alone MMA. But very interesting question nonetheless from Jeff. What are some of the ways that you really take in the sport of mixed martial arts, or just martial arts in general?
I feel like we're nearly like on an IV drip, right? Like, I mean, we are right there front and center. We're talking to the fighters, we're talking to the coaches. So, I mean, by the time the fights come around, we're pretty clued in, I feel like, by the time it's coming around. But I still do listen to a lot of podcasts. I have the Do podcast as well. So you're constantly kind of interacting with the sport. I feel you asked there about books about MMA. Some of the earliest books I read about MMA or about fighting, where I believe it was Sam Sheridan, A Fighter's Heart and a Fighter's Mind. He kind of went around the world and traveled in trained in different disciplines, took on the nutritional programs. I believe in one of the books he was like in the likes of Thailand. He was in New York then, or somewhere on the East Coast anyway. And then he was in Brazil training with, Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu legends. I felt it was really good. It was almost like if Anthony Bourdain was writing a book about combat sports. He was going around getting the feel of every different landscape or atmosphere. So I think it was A Fighter's Mind or A Fighter's Heart by Sam Sheridan, or both of them. It's one or the other. Read them, they're really good. But I feel like we probably do the same things, but we just have the added benefit of actually interacting with the camps and the fighters that might give us that extra sense of or feel of what's going on or what could happen in a fight.
Yeah, I haven't read a whole lot of books about mixed martial arts. I really like long forms quite a bit, whether they're from Kareem or from our former co-workers, Son Al-Shadi and Chuck Mendenhall. I absorb stuff like that, but there's not too many. Like when I'm not covering it, sometimes I need to unplug my brain for mixed martial arts. That might sound weird because of how much I've absorbed throughout the time, but I notice it a lot more. Like I don't know if you know, but I read a lot of comic books. And if there's any sort of martial art involved, I tend to notice like there's like Daredevil ones that Frank Miller's written. There's a lot of Batman ones. Usagi Yojimbo by Sam Sakai. There's even Kung Fu Fighter. There's Iron Fist. Like anytime they use any sort of like judo, like arm drags or double leg takedowns, or sometimes they'll even get arm bars or rear naked chokes and this and that. I'm just like, it pops out to me more. Or I remember one time someone got someone into a Darce choke because he goes, "Oh, I learned this in jiu-jitsu. I'm going to choke him out." And he like clearly the artist that drew it had never done it, but like they'd seen it. So like he's holding his wrist like clearly wrong. Like he's just like holding it like how it's not done. But in the comic book, he's like, I can't remember who's doing it, but in the comic book, he's like holding it on. And I'm just like, that he's literally not doing anything right there. He's just squeezing really tight, and it might hurt, but you're not cutting off the circulation whatsoever. So I tend to notice things a lot more. But podcasts and long form articles seem to be what I absorb the most.
Big love, Jeffrey B.
Yeah, big shout out to Jeffrey B. Of course, you can submit your questions any time of the week. You can submit them. Casey, I'm sure we'll send out the link. We also threw it on our IG stories. Maybe Pete and I will even share the link. You can submit. Try to keep it within 60 seconds. Just tell us your name, where you're from, your question. Keep it concise. You don't need to shove the microphone into your mouth. We love to hear from you guys. Love to see from you guys. Of course, this is only going to be on social medias. We have no idea what we're going to call this segment. Maybe the A+ side. I don't know if I like that. Petesy seems to want to do scissor motions, which means he's slowly moving further and further into the dark madness that is this world. But for Jose, that's Petesy. We'll see you next Wednesday.
Mwah.